Dean Martin was in the middle of telling one of his famous drinking jokes when Johnny noticed something. Something no one else saw. Dean's hands were shaking, not from alcohol, but from something far deeper. What happened over the next 12 minutes would become one of the most heartbreaking moments in Tonight Show history. Dean Martin, the man who made millions laugh, was about to reveal a pain so deep that even Johnny Carson would struggle to hold back his tears. But this story is not just about a television moment. It is about a father's darkest night, the strength of a friendship, and a truth an entire nation grieved together. Because what happened in that studio was not a performance. What happened that night was a bare soul, exposed on live television, March 21st, 1987, Burbank, California, Studio One. The Tonight Show crew was preparing for what they expected to be a cheerful evening. Dean Martin, one of America's most beloved entertainers, was scheduled to appear. The producers expected the usual Dean Martin, easy jokes, playful references to his drinking persona, maybe even a song. But the moment Dean walked through the studio doors, those who truly knew him sensed something was wrong. Dean Martin's career had been built on unshakable confidence. He was half of the legendary Martin and Lewis comedy duo, a member of the Rat Pack alongside Frank Sinatra and Sammy Davis Jr., a film star, a television icon, and a recording artist whose songs defined an era. His public persona rested on effortless charm and relaxed control. That night, nothing about him was effortless. Johnny Carson had known Dean for over 30 years. They had done countless shows together, shared private dinners, played golf, and talked late into the night, conversations the public never saw. Johnny knew Dean's rhythms, his timing, the way he moved and spoke. And the man who stepped onto that stage on March 21st, 1987, was not the Dean Martin Johnny knew. The audience erupted in applause when Dean appeared. They saw what they expected, the immaculate suit, the perfectly styled hair, the familiar smile. But Johnny saw what they couldn't. The smile was forced. The eyes, usually warm and mischievous, were hollow. And the hands that had always held microphones and cocktail glasses without a tremor were shaking. The audience could only see the surface. Johnny could hear the silent scream radiating from every part of his friend. Between two performers who had shared a stage for decades, there was a wordless language. And that language was telling Johnny one thing. My friend is about to collapse. Dean took his seat, and Johnny opened with a familiar line. Dean Martin, ladies and gentlemen, it's always great to have you here. How are you? It was a question Johnny had asked Dean 100 times before, usually a setup for a joke or a playful remark about Dean's legendary drinking. But this time, Dean didn't answer right away. He looked at Johnny, and something passed between them, a moment of recognition, of understanding. Johnny's smile softened, and he leaned forward, giving Dean the space he needed. Johnny, Dean finally said, his voice firmer than usual, I've had better days. The audience laughed, expecting a punchline, but Dean didn't deliver one. He just sat there. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and heavy, like the power had gone out in the room. Crew members exchanged glances. This wasn't planned. This wasn't scripted. Sensing the weight of the moment, Johnny didn't try to fill the silence with humor. He simply asked, Do you want to talk about it? Dean looked down at his hands, the same hands that betrayed everything he was trying to hide. My son, Dean said quietly. I lost my son. The audience fell completely silent. What much of America either didn't know or had forgotten in the 6 months since was that Dean Martin's son, Dean Paul Martin Jr., had died in a military training accident. Known to everyone as Dino, he was 35 years old, an Air National Guard pilot. On March 21st, 1987, he was flying an F-4 Phantom jet over the San Bernardino Mountains when it crashed. March 21st, 1987. Today, this Tonight Show taping was taking place on the exact 6-month anniversary of Dino's death. Johnny's face immediately filled with compassion. Dean, I didn't know you wanted to talk about this. We don't have to if... I need to, Dean interrupted, his voice stronger now. I have to talk about him, Johnny, because if I don't say his name, if I don't speak about him, it's like I lose him a second time. The raw honesty of that moment struck everyone in the studio. This wasn't the polished, unbreakable Dean Martin the world knew. This was a grieving father. The cameras moved closer, not out of voyeurism, but out of respect. A rare moment was unfolding, a real human being breaking down in real time in front of millions. "Tell me about Dino," Johnny said gently, and Dean began. "He was my son," Dean said, and his voice broke instantly. "He was supposed to outlive me. That's how it's supposed to work, right? Parents go first, children go on. That's the natural order." He paused, steadying himself. "Dino was different from me. I built my career playing the drunk, the clown, the guy who never took anything seriously. But Dino took everything seriously. He was a real pilot, Johnny. Not the kind I played in movies, a real military pilot." Dean gripped the arms of the chair, grounding himself. "He called me 2 days before the accident, from the base. And you know what he said? He said, 'Dad, I love what I do. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be.' And I was proud of him, Johnny. So proud." By now, the audience was crying. So were members of the crew. Johnny's eyes shimmered as he fought his own tears. "The day it happened," Dean continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "March 21, 6 months ago today, I was at home when the officers came to my door. The moment I saw them, I knew. Before they said a word, I knew my son was gone." Dean stopped speaking. His entire body was shaking now. Johnny reached out and placed a hand on Dean's arm, a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. The camera captured the moment. Two friends in a studio, sharing the most universal human pain while the world watched. "They told me the jet went down during a training exercise, that it was fast, that he didn't suffer. And I remember thinking, how could they know that? How could they know my son didn't suffer? That he wasn't scared? I wasn't there. I couldn't protect him. I couldn't save him." It was devastating to watch. One of the coolest, most composed performers in entertainment history was falling apart on national television. But something important was happening. Something necessary. Because in that moment, Dean Martin wasn't crying only for himself. He was crying for every parent who had ever lost a child. Across America, people sat in their living rooms thinking, "Someone understands. Someone sees me." "You know what the worst part is?" Dean asked, looking directly at Johnny. "I keep forgetting he's gone. I'll hear something funny and think, I need to call Dino and tell him this. And then I remember, and every time it's like I lose him all over again." Johnny wiped his eyes openly now. "Dean, I can't even imagine what you're going through." "No one can," Dean said, "unless you've lost a child. It's not like losing a parent or a friend. It's like a piece of your soul has been ripped out. There's a hole inside me that nothing fills, not work, not performing, nothing." Millions of viewers felt those words resonate. In quiet living rooms, people cried for the ones they had lost, finally feeling permitted to grieve. Dean glanced toward the audience, as if suddenly remembering how many were watching. "I'm sorry," he said. "You came here to laugh, and I'm making everyone sad." Before Johnny could respond, the studio audience began to applaud. Not the loud, excited applause of entertainment, but something deeper. An applause that said, "We see you, we hear you, your pain matters." Dean looked surprised, moved by the response. He nodded in gratitude, then turned back to Johnny. "Can I tell you something I've never told anyone?" he asked. "Of course," Johnny replied. "The night before Dino died, I had a dream. I dreamed he was flying, and I was on the ground watching him, unable to reach him. I woke up terrified and almost called him right then, but it was 3 a.m. I thought, I'll call him tomorrow." Dean's voice cracked. "But tomorrow never came, Johnny. Tomorrow never came." The guilt was palpable. The weight of an unanswered call, a hesitation that haunted him. "Dean," Johnny said firmly, "you can't blame yourself for not knowing." "But I should have," Dean insisted. "A father should know when his son is in danger. I should have felt something. I should have called him." Johnny leaned forward, his voice calm but resolute. "You loved your son. He knew that. One phone call you didn't make doesn't erase a lifetime of love." Dean absorbed the words. Something shifted, not acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of it. This wasn't therapy. It was one friend telling another the truth. And sometimes, truth is more powerful than professional help. "You know what Dino used to say?" Dean asked, a small smile appearing for the first time. "He'd say, 'Dad, you make people laugh for a living. That matters. You bring people joy.' And I'd tell him, 'What you do is more important. You protect people.' And he'd say, 'We're both important, Dad, just in different ways.'" The smile faded. He was smart, smarter than his old man. Johnny then said something that would become one of the most quoted lines in Tonight Show history. Dean, being a father doesn't end when your child dies. You're still Dino's father, and by talking about him, by keeping his memory alive, you're still taking care of him. Dean looked at Johnny, really looked at him, and slowly nodded. Yeah, I think that's true. Tell us something happy about him, Johnny suggested. Something that made you laugh. Dean's face softened. He had terrible taste in humor. Just awful, long, complicated jokes with no punchline, and he'd laugh before he finished telling them. It drove me crazy. Dean chuckled, a real laugh, cracked with grief. When he was about 12, he decided to teach himself drums. No lessons, just him and a drum set in the garage. And Johnny, it was bad. No rhythm, no pattern, just noise, like someone throwing pots and pans down the stairs. The audience laughed, grateful for the lightness. I go out there and say, Dino, buddy, maybe we should get you some lessons. And he looks at me dead serious and says, Dad, you can't teach feeling. This is jazz. It wasn't jazz, Johnny. It was noise. But he believed it was jazz. Everyone was laughing now, including Dean. The contrast between tears and laughter made the moment even more powerful. This was the nature of grief. Joy and sorrow existing side by side. That was Dino, Dean said warmly. Confident in everything he did, even when he had no idea what he was doing. Johnny smiled. Sounds like he got that from his father. Maybe, Dean admitted. But he was better than me, in everything. The conversation continued for several more minutes. Some memories funny, some tender, all deeply personal. Johnny guided the discussion with care, knowing when to ask questions and when to simply listen. As the interview came to a close, Johnny said, Dean, thank you for sharing Dino with us tonight. I know it wasn't easy. Dean nodded. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Because the people we love don't really die, Johnny. They live on in the stories we tell, in the memories we share. And if I can keep telling stories about my son, then he's still here somehow. Johnny stood and embraced Dean, a long, genuine hug between two men who had shared decades of life. The audience rose to their feet in an ovation that lasted nearly 2 minutes. When Dean finally left the stage, Johnny didn't immediately continue the show. He sat at his desk, visibly collecting himself, then looked into the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, Johnny said, you've just witnessed something important. Dean Martin didn't have to come here tonight. He didn't have to share his pain with us, but he did. And I think he reminded us of something we sometimes forget. Fame, success, talent, none of it protects you from loss. None of it makes you immune to grief. Johnny paused, choosing his words carefully. But what Dean showed us tonight is that even in our deepest pain, we can still honor those we've lost. We can say their names, we can tell their stories, and by doing that, we keep them alive. The studio fell silent. This was no longer just a talk show. It was a collective act of mourning. The reaction to Dean Martin's appearance was overwhelming. NBC received more than 50,000 letters in the weeks that followed, many from parents who had lost children, grateful to see their grief acknowledged so openly. Mental health professionals praised the interview for helping normalize conversations about loss. Until then, public figures rarely spoke so candidly about such personal pain. Dean's willingness to be vulnerable helped countless people feel less alone. But perhaps the deepest impact was felt by families watching quietly, fathers who had lost children and never spoken about it, mothers afraid to share their sorrow. They watched Dean and realized something profound. Breaking down is not weakness, it is dignity. Dean Martin continued performing after that night, but something had changed. The ever-present drink, once part of his act, was gone. He was still Dean Martin, but he was also a father carrying his son's memory with honor. 3 years after that Tonight Show appearance, Dean Martin gave his final concert. He was 72, his health declining. Before leaving the stage, he did something unexpected. He looked out at the audience and said, "This last song is for my son, my Dino. I hope he's watching somewhere and knows his old man is thinking about him." Then Dean Martin sang Everybody Loves Somebody. But he sang it differently, slower, more tender, every word heavy with meaning. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Dean Martin died on December 25, 1995, at the age of 78. Among his belongings, his family found a photograph of him with Johnny Carson from that Tonight Show night. On the back, Dean had written, "The night I talked about my son, the night I began to heal." In later years, Johnny often referred to that interview as one of the most important moments of his career. "Dean taught me something that night," Johnny said in a 1997 interview. "Sometimes the most important thing a television show can do isn't entertain, it's bear witness. We witnessed Dean's grief, and by doing that, we honored his son." The legacy of that March 21, 1987 interview extends far beyond Dean and Johnny. It changed how public figures approached grief, proving that vulnerability is not weakness and that acknowledging pain does not diminish strength. The young pilot Dino Martin became more than a tragic footnote in his father's biography. Through Dean's willingness to speak his name, share his memories, and tell his stories, Dino became real to millions who never knew him. And perhaps that is the greatest gift a parent can give a child, to make sure they are remembered, to make sure their life mattered, to make sure their story continues even after they are gone. When Dean Martin walked onto the Tonight Show stage that night, he carried unbearable grief. He left carrying something else as well, the knowledge that he was not alone, that his pain was valid, and that loving his son did not end when his son's life did. Johnny Carson gave Dean the space to break, to be honest, to be human. In doing so, he showed millions of viewers that it's okay not to be okay, that grief deserves acknowledgement, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit you are hurting. Two fathers, two friends, and a conversation that reminded America that behind every famous face is a human heart, fragile, breakable, and deeply capable of love. If this story moved you, if you've lost someone and felt that same impossible grief, know that you are not alone. Subscribe for more stories about the moments that define us as human beings. Share this with someone who needs to know that grief is not something to hide, but something to honor. And leave a comment for someone you've lost who deserves to be remembered. Because Dean Martin was right. The people we love never truly die, as long as we keep telling their stories.